I call this bread the stud muffin, but actually it's not a muffin at all. It's a giant savory brioche with 3 cheeses, Parmesan, Romano, and Gruyere. Little bits of the Gruyere get studded into the top crust where they caramelize and become extra delicious. I start this bread by making a sponge. And that's simply using some of the bread flour or all-purpose flour, the instant yeast, and because it's instant or rapid rise, I can add it right to the flour. I don't have to proof it with water. And the water. And this is just room temperature water. It gets whisked together to form a kind of stiff pancake-like batter. By doing this, I'm going to get extra flavor. And I allow it to sit for an hour, or about up to 4 hours if I want. It may seem like starters are a lot of extra work, but look, it only takes under a minute to mix. And then they sit just on their own, where they develop extra flavor while you're doing other tasks. So cover this with plastic wrap and allow it to sit for 1 up to 4 hours to develop flavor. And here I have one that's done just that, and you can see how billowy and light it is. It's ready to use. So I'm going to leave it covered while I grate the cheese. I have Parmesan and Gruyere cheese, and I'm using the blades, the metal blades of the food processor to grate, not a grater, because it's really fast this way. Then I'll switch to the dough blades to do the rest of the dough. I want to grate the cheese fine because it's the Gruyere cheese that is going to be coarser and form little air pockets in the bread. This is my all-purpose unbleached flour. Actually, I'm going to weigh it first and see the entire amount because it should be 12 ounces or 2½ cups. And of course, it's always faster and more accurate to weigh than to measure. It's exactly 12 ounces. I'll remove scant ¼ cup, and we'll see if we were going to need to add it or not. And now in this coffee filter, I can just pour it very easily right into the food processor. And then I'm going to add the black pepper, which is what blends so nicely with the cheese to give it a lot of zip. Instant yeast, more instant yeast. And then with a little whisk, I'll just whisk it around because I never want salt to land directly on yeast. That's the one major enemy of yeast, salt or hot water. But in this case, we want cold water, so that's no danger. Now the salt. And then to make it a little bit more even, I'll just process it for a few seconds to get that yeast and black pepper and salt into the flour mixture. Now I'm going to add the egg. It's going to be a cold egg and cold water because you'd be surprised that the food processor builds up so much heat it could rise 10 degrees if I don't start with cold liquid, and there's no reason not to. First, the starter is scraped on the top. Now you'll be able to see how billowy and full of air it is. You see the texture also, which is really beautiful. It's all those strands of gluten that develop during the rising of the yeast, the rising of the dough. And it smells wonderful because of the alcohol that is actually it's called a waste product. When yeast feeds on the sugars in the flour, it builds up different flavors, carbon dioxide that helps the dough to rise, and alcohol that gives it wonderful flavor. And the butter. Now with the motor on, I'm going to add the cold egg mixture. In a steady stream. You can see the dough is beginning to form, but before I continue, you can see what a nice rough dough it is, but very sticky right now. I'll add the grated Parmesan and Romano. And Romano is actually a sheep's milk cheese and has quite a different flavor. It's usually more salty. That's why I don't add too much salt to this dough, because you have a lot of salt from the cheese. And now I process it 15 seconds, and it forms a soft but rough dough. I love the way it pushes up. You can tell it's getting very vibrant because it pushes up the top. And it's very sticky, so I can see that I'm going to need to add at least half of the reserve flour. The pleasure of making bread is that you get to smell it all the while from the earliest part of doing it, and it smells absolutely fabulous, that yeasty smell. Okay, I guess we're going to need almost all of it. And now I'm going to scrape it out onto the counter. Actually, I have some of that non-stick rule pat here, so I don't have to add as much flour. And I love this little, it's called a flour wand, because you can pick up flour with it, then it holds it in so that when you're dusting it, maybe it's called a flour duster, it dusts very evenly and you don't add too much. I'm patting it out into a rough rectangle so that I can add the bits of the Gruyere cheese. But first, I want to make sure that it's a good consistency. Whenever I work with dough, I always have a dough scraper, because if it should stick to the counter, instead of adding more flour, I can just lift it up with a dough scraper. A dough scraper, bakers consider it an extension of their hand, but one that's less sticky, because somehow the heat of the hand always makes everything stick to it. Okay, this is a soft, silky, beautiful dough, but it's still not totally smooth, because during the rising process, it will continue to develop strength as the yeast continues to feed and the flour absorbs the water. And now I'm ready to add the cubes of the Gruyere. And I do it as I would do a jelly roll. Just evenly distribute them and roll it up and knead it in. And the wonderful thing about these cubes of Gruyere is not just the flavor that it gives, but the Gruyere melts in there so that you have these little holes, these open holes that are coated with the Gruyere cheese. This bread is so fabulous. It stays fresh for 3 days, and you can toast it. You can eat it plain with butter. It's lovely sliced thin with prosciutto, the way they would in Italy. They don't call it a stud muffin there, though, I'm sure. A lot of people wonder what exactly is kneading. Kneading is, first of all, it's to develop the strength of the dough and to make it smooth. And basically, it's just 2 motions. You bring the dough out and forward. With the heel of your hand, press it forward again. Then turn it, a half turn, quarter turn actually, and again, bring it forward, push it back. And as it's getting a little sticky, bring it with a bench scraper, press it out, bring it forward like a wave or a roll, and push it back. And when you do it quickly, it looks different, so it's good to slow down and watch exactly what's happening here. And now this dough is going to rise overnight. And of course you could bake it sooner, but this is what gives it a fabulous flavor. So just spray a bowl. It's a very active dough, so during the first hour or 2, go back into the refrigerator. You'll want to see it anyway, just to smell it and see what's going on with it. It's exciting. Push it down in the bowl, and you know that it's going to rise about up to here. But as it's rising during the first hour and again after the second, push it down because it could come up to here. It's so full of life. And I like to cover it, of course, with plastic wrap because otherwise it will crust over. And I'm going to refrigerate it. I have one in the refrigerator ready to roll.